This is a review of The World of Kong, A Natural History of Skull Island. And this is a tricky one because I can't really put my finger on whether or not it's good. And that's because it's trapped in this valley between being a bad idea that's been well executed and being a good idea that's been poorly executed. So most of this review is going to be quite critical, but if you're a big fan of the movie, or just somebody interested in creature design or fictitious zoology, I encourage you to stick around to the end because there will be a positive flip side of this review for you. So basically this is the art book for Peter Jackson's 2005 King Kong, but it's done kind of more like a lore book, or more specifically a fictitious natural history book on Skull Island. This idea of repurposing concept art to create some sort of lore book is something you do see occasionally, and I think it's great. I wish we saw more of it, in fact. But in this instance, for this movie, it doesn't work, or at least doesn't work well enough. Most movies or video games that have lore books are done because they have huge, rich worlds with intricate histories, mythologies, characters, different factions, locations, and so on that are required for this sort of deep, textured world building. Whereas with this book, it's not really world building, it's just island building, and not a particularly interesting one either, simply because there's basically no history. And by history, I really mean story. No characters, no human interest, nothing to really engage with except jungles and dinosaurs, which is really all there is to this book. And I mean, as an idea, that's probably cool enough, but reading endless profiles for fake dinosaurs is not exactly sustainable reading over 200 pages. I've gone through this book 3 or 4 times over the years, and I'll be perfectly honest, I've probably read less than 30% of the text. And that's because about 30-40 pages in, and I'm bored. And so I just end up paging through the rest of the book looking at the images, occasionally reading a profile for any of the creatures that look especially interesting, which admittedly isn't as horrible as it sounds, because the fact is the art is really, really nice. But even though the write-up for each of the creature or location profiles is also really good, really intelligent and believable, on their own, they're really interesting. However, once you start reading 10 in a row, they all start to blend together. Where they live, what they eat, how they defend themselves, reproduction. Now, to be fair, that's not because the writing's bad. You'd feel the exact same way if you were reading an actual zoology or paleontology book. But the big difference is that would be more interesting because you can chalk it up to actual education. Whereas with this book, there's no deeper application or context for what you're reading, so it just becomes unbearably tedious despite being very well done. And I mean, it is really inspiring to see how much thought and care has been put into creating the island and inhabitants, but the thing is, who cares? This idea of needing either application and or story is very important because with other lore books, say for The World of Ice and Fire, which I have reviewed previously, there is so much more to the world than just descriptions of animals and locations. There's characters and stories and politics and magic and so on. There's enough different stuff going on to keep your interest. And yeah, at times that book can be quite boring, like an actual history book, but even then, at least it's giving me information and context I can apply to actual stories, i.e. the books. Whereas with this book, it doesn't really deepen my experience of the movie to rewatch it and see a certain type of dinosaur and know what its fake Latin name is, or that its young start walking within half an hour of hatching. The other way these lore books or even just in-world books are at their best, even better than just presenting information about the world, is when they're actually entertaining in their own right. And I think that would have been a much better approach for this book, to inject some sense of character and story to follow along with, even if it's only in a subtle or indirect sense. In fact, the conceit of this book, according to the Dust Jacket, is that this book is a compilation of the research undertaken by the various scientific expeditions to the island that took place after Kong's death in New York. That's a really cool idea and a great way to continue the story, but there's absolutely no follow-through on the idea in this book. The whole book feels like it's written by one omnipotent author, whereas I think it would have been a lot more fun to give character to the text through journal extracts and other paraphernalia to overcome this otherwise monotonous text. In fact, even Peter Jackson's foreword seems to undermine the idea of presenting this book as the real history of Skull Island. It's written the exact same way you would expect for a normal non-fiction art book, which is surprising coming from the man who directed Forgotten Silver, that he wouldn't play up this idea and say something like, oh, these were the research journals we used to help inform our film. On the DVD there's actually a kind of fake documentary called Skull Island: A Natural History, which, as it sounds, is very similar to this book, but not as thorough. I actually like it even less than this book, which at least has the potential to be charming. I think having interviews with filmmakers where they blur the line between fact and fiction is more annoying than entertaining. And so ultimately, although I love the idea of using concept art to create a fiction book, I suspect that for this movie, it would have been wiser just to do a normal, non-fiction art book with the artists and filmmakers talking about creating it. And then they could have also explained most of this background lore anyway, and how they came up with the creatures and the real-world inspirations. And also, this would have meant they could have included the New York artwork as well, which, because of the restrictive nature of this book, is completely absent, which seems a little unimaginative considering that this book could have opened in New York with newspaper articles or something. And because the book fails to be engaging, all of the text just feels like a waste of space, which is a shame because that then prevents it from being a great art book, and so much of the wonderful art you see glimpses of in the DVDs are not included in this book, either because there isn't room due to all the text, or because the art doesn't necessarily fit in with this extremely limited direction of the book. So as a record of the art and design work done for this film, it fails as an art book, and it fails as a piece of entertaining fiction. But I really do want to end this review on a more positive and productive note, rather than just continue to bemoan how something should have been done, because as ever, the reality is the book is what it is. So really the only important thing is there anyone I would recommend this book to? Is there anyone who will enjoy it and find it worth their time and money? And the answer is yes, absolutely. For most people, this book isn't going to be interesting enough to be worth the price of admission just to see some cool dinosaur art. However, the idea that a book's value is measured by the width of its audience is obviously nonsense. Its success is measured by how well it appeals to its specific audience. And so there are two types of people I think will actually really appreciate this book in a way that a lot of people, myself included, may not. First of all, obviously, if you're someone who is a really big fan of the movie, sometimes I recommend a book to the mega completionist fan just because, even if the book is genuinely bad, they'll be happy to have it just for the sake of having it as part of their collection. But in this case, I really do think it's a pretty cool piece of merchandise for fans. It looks great, a lot of thought and care has been put into it, and you may actually enjoy learning about the minutiae of Skull Island, especially because so many of the creatures in the book never made it to screen, and that's always the best sort of thing to see in an art book. In fact, it also includes illustrations that were done specifically for this book, which again is an admirable testament to the effort put into it. The other person who I think would like this book would be someone interested in creature design, zoology, paleontology, of the fictitious variety, of course. I actually saw that someone created like character sheets for all of the creatures based on this book for their Pulp RPG campaign, so it's cool to see that it can appeal to a more indirect audience too. And I mean, you really don't have to be a fan of the movie to enjoy this book. You don't even have to have seen it, honestly. You can definitely enjoy it as someone who just likes dinosaurs, dinosaur art, or even if you like the zoological aspect, because like I said, despite being made up, it's intelligently done and certainly inspired by well-researched actual physiology and ecology. And so on that note, some other recommendations. Well, I'm not even going to go into all of the dinosaur and prehistoric animal related books, as there are just billions. The coolest prehistoric art, although perhaps not the most accurate, invariably comes from vintage books, but unfortunately I've really only seen them online, so I don't have enough knowledge to recommend any specifically. So any visual books on the subject published pretty much any time throughout the 20th century may be worth looking into, because the problem I have with a lot of the modern books from this century is that they often use too much of that really, really awful CGI style, and I mean, is it really art if it looks like something uploaded to DeviantArt in 2002 by someone who just got their hands on some 3D modeling software? Which is why Paleo Art by Tarshan is a pretty awesome anthological history of paleontology art. But if I did have to recommend something with more modern artists, then there's 2 volumes just called Dinosaur Art. They're also anthologies and are a really good starting point. In terms of specific artists, definitely Charles R. Knight's art book. Also a book on William Stout called Prehistoric Life Murals is pretty cool too. But in terms of similar books and art that treats imagined creatures as scientific, there are actually a surprising number of those sort of books too, cryptozoology books and so on. But just to highlight some I was reminded of when reading this Kong book, Terrell Whitledge did a pretty cool book called The Wildlife of Star Wars, as well as her own book, Animals, Real and Imagined. There was one published in the 80s by Douglas Dixon called After Man. His visions are a little weird and not the most believable, but still a great book worth checking out if you're into this sort of thing. Speaking of weird and kind of related in a pulpy adventure sort of way, S. Peterson's Field Guide to Lovecraftian Horrors. Like I said, there are just so many of these types of field guide books and I really like them, so I definitely want to hear about any favorites you have in the comments. Also, for more fun and fantasy dinosaur books, I've already mentioned Dinotopia by the incomparable James Gurney. There's also a book called Dinosaurology, which is one of those ology books, if you're familiar with those, like Dragonology, etc. Which is interesting because it's a fun book with great art and a lot more texture to the writing, and a little closer to what I think this Skull Island book should have been doing. Speaking of Skull Island, for the Kong-specific fans, there's The Art and Making of Kong, Skull Island for the 2017 movie, which is about as bog-standard an art book as you can possibly imagine. And then lastly, there's The Making of King Kong for the 1933 movie, and another book called The Making of King Kong, which is for the 2005 version, which is actually the subject of our next review.